Presidential appointments are one of the central powers of the office. Presidents appoint around 4,000 individuals to the federal government. Most of them don't require Senate confirmation, but the most visible, the most powerful positions do require the Senate to confirm the appointees. It is one of the most important powers that the president wields, and also one of the least appreciated powers that presidents wield. Vacancies in appointed positions can go on for years. In some presidencies, they go on indefinitely, in part because presidents fail to select people, in part because the Senate fails to confirm people. But what appointees do within the federal government is manage it. Those 4,000 individuals direct public policy in almost every agency of the federal government, and individually, even though they serve at the pleasure of the president, have substantial power over the direction of what Americans see every day as the manner in which their government operates. And while the appointments process is subject to some of the most divisive politics that exist in the American system, it still remains one of its most important, the president's most important powers.
One role of the president and one power of the presidency that I think is widely unnoticed is the president's ability to appoint members to the Supreme Court and to all the federal courts, the courts of appeal and the district courts. Presidents require, or needed, their appointees require confirmation by the Senate. But these appointees that become judges on the federal bench have lifetime tenure. And so presidents are very careful about selecting individuals that reflect their priorities, and hopefully, for many, many years, for decades to come, will continue to represent a philosophy that is in line with the president's. There are cases in which a president's nominee to the Supreme Court, or even to federal district courts or appellate courts, are rejected, but those are few and far between. The data show that when there's a unified government, meaning that the Congress is of the same party, the majorities are of the same party as the president, that presidential judicial nominations are confirmed very frequently. I would say probably above 90% of the time. When there's divided government, especially when the Senate is of the opposing party, you might expect that there's a little bit more friction there. But what we find is that presidents then simply moderate their choices. So instead of selecting an individual for the bench that is very liberal or very conservative, one of the two, they try to find somebody who is moderate, whose prior professional career demonstrates that they have fulfilled positions, that they have written judicial opinions that don't reflect a conservative, solidly conservative or solidly liberal ideology. And so even in cases when you do have divided government, many times those nominees are, they're nominated and they are approved of by the Senate, and so they're sitting on the bench. I would say that the obvious limitation to presidents in terms of nominating members to the bench is the frequency with which Supreme Court seats turn over. I mean, there are 9 individuals. Many of them are older now, but they have a tendency to stay in those jobs a long time. They must be very good jobs because there's not a lot of turnover. And so you may have a president that for 4 years doesn't get a single Supreme Court nomination, Supreme Court nomination. But at the same time, people people are less likely to notice all of the seats at the federal bench, the district court and the appellate court, and those courts are very important as well. We tend to focus on the Supreme Court, but all of those appointments that come at the other level are very, very important.
The federal courts are staffed in a variety of ways. Some have very direct presidential intervention, some have less direct presidential intervention, and in some cases, presidents have very little to do with it other than to submit a name. Federal district court judges, the lowest tier judges in the federal judiciary, in some cases are appointed based on the recommendations of a senior senator in a state, a practice that used to be called blue slipping, but has worn on for quite some time. The idea being that senators from given states are going to be well aware of the judicial capacity within that state, and federal district court appointments are many, and they don't rise really to the level of the need for presidential attention. The federal courts of appeals are different. The federal courts of appeals, the president often relies on those around him, their staff, to find the right individuals. For contentious nominees or for very important seats on courts, sometimes presidents will intervene in selecting who goes to the courts of appeals. And then, of course, for the U.S. Supreme Court, presidents are highly engaged, both with their staff and with the nominees directly and prospective nominees, to make sure that they find the right one. Finding the wrong one could mean decades of different policy, or it could mean a sloppy, messy, politically damaging confirmation process.
The other important point to make about judicial nominations is that presidents don't unilaterally, while they have the unilateral authority to make these nominations, there's a great deal of consultation with members of Congress, particularly those of their own party, with constituents, with interest groups that have a strong interest in certain issues. People are constantly lobbying for or against potential nominees. At the point that somebody announces that they're resigning from the Supreme Court, the president has probably known that for weeks, that was going to come down the pike. And the president's White House counsel's office has probably been working for years, or since they entered office, putting together a short list of candidates that they would like to nominate to the bench. This isn't something that happens quickly. They vet each of these nominees very carefully. President Nixon had some difficulty with his nominations to the Supreme Court. He had 2 rejections, and then finally he had a success with William Rehnquist. The problem with that was that President Nixon lost a lot of political capital in those fights with Congress, with the Senate, for those particular judicial nominations. So presidents since Nixon are very careful to nominate somebody that will not ruffle a lot of feathers. There was the incident of Clarence Thomas in 1992, in which the Bush administration took a lot of heat. It was very controversial. The vote was very close. He obviously became a Supreme Court justice, but again, the administration lost a lot of political capital in that battle. So ever since the Thomas nomination, presidents are very careful to nominate somebody who's more of middle of the road, whose career has been more middle of the road than to either pick a very conservative or very liberal justice.